Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Jen Stone here. So today, since the BaZi Gratitude Series rolled out for the first time, I'm actually streaming here at Feng Shui by Jen. I'm back in Scottsdale. So this whole COVID thing, started. I have not been back to my studio space in more than 8 weeks. So talk about the things that we're grateful for. I'm definitely really grateful for being here. But besides that, today we have Michelle Cottingham, and I feel like she's a sister from a different mother. We share some similar backgrounds, and we're going to be talking about ancestral roots, kind of a deep subject, but subject that fascinates me, and I think that everybody can relate to it. Michelle is an award-winning realtor here in the Phoenix metro area. She has a brand called the House of M. She's a mama, a partner, a daughter, a sister, among many other things. We actually met at a feng shui real estate workshop that I was teaching right here at the ranch many years ago. And she has been a client and a friend since then, and the perfect guest to be on today to talk a little bit about ancestral roots. So I know we're going to be gabbing quite a bit, Michelle. So why don't you just give our viewers a little bit of description about what it is that you do and tell us a little bit about your background?
Wow, that's so broad.
I know.
Hi everyone, happy hump day. There's so many things that ancestral roots could mean to me, but perhaps it might make the most sense to orient myself geographically in the United States of America. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and I have for, how old is Dresden? 13, almost 14 years now. And I first actually moved here a long time ago and then moved back home. But I'm originally born and raised in Long Beach, California. And I am the daughter of a Filipina immigrant and a blue-eyed Southern California born and raised white guy. And I grew up in Southern California in that very rich kind of family, very tight-knit around all my Filipino family. But I didn't recognize at the time, you're in a little bubble of childhood and that relevance. So it wasn't until very recently that I did start to become more and more aware of what that meant for me personally in the whole story of the world, not just in the story of my own family. But yeah, I have been in here in Phoenix for a while, and since then my family, my immediate family has moved here in spurts and moved back to California. My mother is here and those types of things. But I sell real estate. That sounds oversimplified, but that's the nuts and bolts of it. I've also been an educator in the real estate space for 5+ years. So continuing education, and then I have these passion projects that I'll roll out, different sorts of educational seminar things that have nothing to do with sales or real estate. And I'm still testing out what that means for me in my life's work beyond, something that's, I don't want to say transactional, but it is transactional in real estate, right? There's a contract and there's a client and there's a sale and there's a closing commission. So I don't know if that helped a ton, but that's kind of a little bit of what I do beyond the real estate thing, which probably could be a whole class, but we said we weren't going to do that. So.
There's no talk on feng shui and real estate in this series. Yeah. So, Michelle, you talked about you have a Filipina mom and a white guy for a dad. Just getting straight to, but my background is quite similar to yours. My mother is also Filipina. My father was Spanish, but I was born in Hong Kong, and my family moved to the States when I was a teenager. And then, of course, I traveled quite extensively all throughout my life, ever since I was little. So you kind of get a sense that, there are other cultures, there's a different way of life. But for me, when we talk about ancestral roots, to me, ancestral roots, I immediately think of grandparents, right? But I never met my grandparents. I have aunts and uncles and such. But I feel that after my family moved to the States, I lost a lot of that part of who I am through the eyes and the experiences of my parents. I'm just so curious about, do you recall that moment when you felt really compelled, this itch, this motivation to want to dig deeper into, you know, what this culture is all about, what is that way of life. And you have children, you have 3 kids, and how do you see yourself transferring some of that wisdom that you've gained from the older folks?
Well, I grew up with my maternal, so my Filipino, my grandmother, my Lola. We didn't call her Lola though. We call her Granny. But Antonia Agraviador is her name. And I grew up with her very proximate. I was not as involved with her as some of my other cousins. I did not grow up with, even though I was in a primarily Anglo white suburban part of Long Beach, Southern California, right? I grew up really tight knit with all my Filipino cousins. Myself, my sister, and my brother were the only mixed race ones in that kind of core. And I know that the term, and acknowledge and dislike that the term tribe is misused, but it was quite tribal, right? In that community way where the community helps raise the children and support the parents. You have this multi-generational support system going on. You know, you're thought of as very special, but you're also not that special. Like, go pick up your mess. And we also saw you picking your nose, even though you got honor roll at school. So there's always this sort of humbling thing about you, the way your family is. But I guess for me, I had a lot of assumptions about, or lack of awareness about, what ancestry actually meant. And it wasn't until really this last year of my life, as I've been in this really intense process, which is laid out in my BaZi, of learning and rooting and centering myself in a myriad of ways, making errors along the way, of course, that I started to really become curious, compelled to understand what these patterns were in my family, why the stereotypes of Filipino Americans exist. And also, I had early experiences, even as early as 2nd or 3rd grade, where I remember understanding that I was othered in all racial groups, meaning white. I did not actually understand a lot of white American traditions because that wasn't normal in my family. Even though I look white and I have the green eyes and my name is white and American and I am a white woman, I also identified with the Filipino American customs. And so I didn't really usually click up as, I never had an experience where I was completely myself or whole in with like the white girls at school, right? Pop Warner cheerleading, like none of it ever worked. And then same thing with Filipinos or Southeast Asian like groups. So like, where is my place? And even within my own family, we were the few mixed, there's not, most of my cousins were, so you don't see yourself everywhere, you don't hear yourself. You kind of learn about what it is to move in and out of groups and see yourself as with, but not always of them. And when I had those early experiences, as early as 2nd and 3rd grade, I remember being picked on or bullied, being called out for my brown skin, and then being fetishized almost by Filipino community because of the green eyes, and all this stuff. You're like, what is this? I'm just Michelle Bolig. I'm just me, and I'm just doing what I'm doing. So I kind of just had a lot of assumptions about what it meant to be who I was with the family I was. And I had a story that I told myself, and it wasn't a fake story, but it wasn't a completely informed story. And so about a year to a year and a half ago, I began to really dig into what is the history of my mother's line? Like, what is the history of Filipinos beyond what we think we know in the last 50 years, beyond the Joe Coy comedians.
Yeah, the comedians.
This kind of tokenization. So I jumped into that, and I'm fumbling around in the mess of it, but it has really intensified the last year and a half as I've tried to reconcile my own family patterns, my inheritance of what that means for me with my mother line, and also to understand what that means for my father's side of the family, and the Americanness of who I am. You throw me out into a group of Filipino Americans or into the Philippines, like, I'm not really so Filipino, am I? So it's like reconciling that mixed race heritage what that might mean for me here where I am, and then looking up the lines on both sides and saying, how is it that I came to be? What have I inherited? What do I hope to pass along to my own children? What do I hope to enrich in my own life in this time that I'm here? So it intensified in the last year and a half. I don't know that I could say that there's one specific thing, but I bet you probably could, because you have the charts and the knowings of the things.
Well, I find it so fascinating following your journey when you went back to the Philippines recently, and I'm so curious to hear more about your experience there. And, you are actually called, there's a label that people call her type. She's called mestiza. And mestiza is that they're Filipinos, but they look white, which, duh, of course, you're half white and half Filipino. But a lot of the Filipino ancestry also came from Spain. And so, for example, my father was Spanish. And so he had light eyes, light skin. And, obviously I got more of the olive skin from my mother, but his other children were actually born blonde hair, blue eyes. So when you go to the Philippines these days and you look like a mestiza or a mestizo, you stick out. And they can either target you, or they're curious about you. They love you. They want to follow you around.
They don't like you, or they don't. They reject you.
Yes.
Like you are a representation of some very harmful violence that's happening. Like, it's wild. It's so like you're the gatekeeper to all of that.
Yes.
You physically embody being a gatekeeper to all of that knowledge and history, and you didn't choose it. You just got plunked into it. So. Yeah, for sure. And that your dad is Spanish is immediate, like puts you right on the edge of it. And but you're born in Hong Kong. See, I didn't have, not that I was lacking, but I didn't have those early travel experiences. Travel has just been a newer part of my adult practice in the last 2 to 3 years. And to travel to multiple places, sometimes just feeling called to go there, like, okay, I'm just gonna go, just book it. There was one weekend, I just booked it and I left. And then I came back because I felt like called to go. It seems like, this fancy, wealthy travel blogger type of thing, but there's a searching for yourself. I understand when I read some social justice and the historian and the academic labels of this, that's you in the diaspora really trying to find yourself in the world because you've been displaced, right? That's what the term means. You have been displaced from where you're from. And so you're craving that connection. And so you're trying to find those things. Can you find that, you can find that in your garden, you can find that in your books, you can meditate it, but there's something about finding that inner earth that's calls your body. So yeah, the trip to the Philippines, I literally would wake up in the middle of the night and I would feel like whispers of my aunts. I don't know how to describe it. I grew up, I went to Catholic school. I didn't grow up with a lot of this mystical thinking, a lot of woo-woo stuff. I mean, Catholicism is its own thing, but definitely that was not cheered on to think of like you're being called to by ancestors. But it was like my titas are calling me, please come now. So I went, and of course then we went to a global pandemic, and then I got shut down and I had to rush back.
But it's so interesting because I remember when my mother would take me back to the Philippines when I was younger, right before the plane would land, my mother would tell me very specifically, don't speak English, keep your mouth shut, only speak in Tagalog. And I understand the language, but if I start speaking it, you could tell that that I am not like a native speaker of the language. But for you as an adult, going in, it's harder for you to blend unless you're wearing sunglasses and you just don't speak. How was your experience? And take us a brief journey into like, what did you did while you were there? Family members, storytelling, that kind of stuff.
So my mom's youngest brother, my mom's specific family story is not the more typical Filipino, like 1960s, 70s immigration wave that came here. They call it in Filipino intellect circles, the brain drain. All of the talent, all of the intellect that was already there in the Philippines came to the United States, perfectly coiffed to admire that America was this thing to attain. Americanization, I need to come there to better the life of my, whatever the story is. My mom's even though the timing is the late 70s, right, that she immigrated to the United States, actually her family was in Nigeria, Africa for several years before they came to the US. And they left Nigeria because of family abuse. There was abuse in the family. And as she grew older, they left there to come to the United States to kind of pick up the pieces of what they were going to do. And they left the Philippines to Nigeria sort of begrudgingly, right? When I say that, of course, as a teenager, you don't want your parents, or middle school, or just developmentally, you don't want to be disrupted from the social development you might be in. But long story short, my mom's youngest brother, who I'm very close with since my infancy, he did not leave Africa when they left Africa to come to the United States. He actually stayed there with my grandmother for, I think, a couple more years. And so my uncle has been in his own, I don't know that he would identify it this way, but he's been in his own process of trying to regain himself in the world and his culture and who he is in that world. And so as such, in the last handful of years, he's been he's been moving back and forth to the US and the Philippines. He also does humanitarian aid work and brings supplies out to very, very remote areas where they don't have electricity. And it's what people in the Western world be like, oh, these people live in poverty, right? They don't have whatever the stuff is that people are supposed to have, right? Electricity, plumbing, civilization, okay? Whatever is to be civilized.
The things we take for granted.
Sure, but maybe it's not necessary either. I mean, I'm in that place where I'm like, are they uncivilized? Or like, how civilized are we? I don't know. So long story short, I went there and my uncle became my tour guide. And so when I he lives just outside of Manila, in a town or in a city called Antipolo. It's like a suburban city, but it's just more of Manila sprawl. And we took 2 adventure runs. One was up to the very far north, not that far from where my mother is from. And that is mountain range people. These are headhunters, and we went far, like hiking up the mountain. There's no grid. And it wasn't just like ecotourism, it was just to go be with people he's brought supplies to. We were their guests. We slept on the floor in the wood shelter, and we ate foraged food. And it wasn't just to go see how cool it is and to be unplugged, it was to really appreciate where my people are from and to see what it might, not to see, but I just needed to go. I just had to go. So we went up north into a province called Kalinga. And Filipino Americans might recognize Kalinga because there's a worldwide sensation named Juan Od, who does the buktuk, the ancient tattoo art that's like tick, 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 tuk, tuk, whatever the terminology is. Forgive me, I'm not saying it right. She's in Kalinga province. And so we went up into the mountains and hung there for a couple of nights. It was grounding. I slept incredibly well. The full moon of March was at that time. And it was like being so grounded into the earth because you're in the, mountains. And then we returned to his place in the city, and the grumblings of what was going on globally were happening, definitely, obviously being in the continent of Asia. But the Philippines was not experiencing anything wild at that time. And then we took off on another adventure run a little bit further south, but still in the mid-level of the Philippine archipelago, to an island off of an island off of an island. And the island is called Marinduque, and then the island off the island was called Gaspar. There's maybe 90 families living there. Again, no electrical poles, there's no sewer system. They're living on the beach. These are fisher people, I'll say fishermen families, just kind of doing their thing. It was beautiful. The children were able to just be free in both of those areas. But I can't say that now, sitting in the middle of May 2020, I left March 1st, 2020. I cannot say that I have integrated or processed most of what I experienced there. And I think the truth is that that I don't need to, that I need to just let it sit with me and to see what the meaning of that is, and that maybe I don't have to do with anything with what I learned or observed there. So
I'm curious to hear about your conversation with your mom, you know, with you preparing to go to the Philippines, and what are her thoughts about that? And also, what have you told your children? You know, it's kind of like this multi-generational, and you're like the glue between the older and the future generation. So I'm curious about that conversation with your mom.
my mom was gonna go, actually. Well, first I was gonna go, then my mom was not gonna go, then she's gonna go, then she booked, then she canceled, then I'm changing my things, all of this. And then up until really quarantine became a global necessity, quarantining of people and communities, and definitely how Duterte managed it in the Philippines was just like, right? That's a heavy, dense Manila population there, you know. So my mom still had plans to, she tried to come twice, and it just, the stars were not aligned for it. I don't know any other way to say that. My mom was so supportive. I would not say that my mom drove me towards any of it or drove me away from any of it. I think my mom had, this is my interpretation, that my mom and I have a unique sort of mother-daughter relationship where either of us really demands much from the other. I don't have a large demand that my mom be or do anything for me, and vice versa. But I really did look forward to going to see her hometown, and that she would be there. Not to, it's very common in Filipino culture, in the Philippines and Filipino Americans, to show your kids off. It's like a thing.
Yeah.
Like, I gotta show my,
Oh my God, I'm a trophy.
It's like a trophy. Like, look at my kid, and then do the thing, and look at her and her eyes,
Yes.
and you know, whatever the thing is, you gotta do the thing. So sure, my mom could do the thing, and everyone's gonna be my aunt and uncle, which for sure they ain't, but whatever, maybe they are. They might be. I was looking forward to seeing my mother in that space, just to experience and breathe and walk those streets with her, because my mother is also in her own process of reconnecting to what her childhood might have been like had they not displaced themselves or been displaced, right? And so the conversations were positive. My children were super supportive. They're used to me being like, I'm out, I'm gonna be gone for a little while, so I'll see you in a minute. Mom, can I come with you? Not this trip, but maybe we'll work some things out. And as I was there, I shared photos, and my mom and I were messaging, and the children and I were messaging, and none of us were trying to foster anything out of it. It was just sharing. And obviously when you're there, you're in a state of awe and humility. And I was sharing with the children, and I could see that these children are very drawn to understanding what it means to be there too, for themselves.
Yeah.
Not just because it seems cool. I mean, even my children are technically less than 25% Filipino. So at that level, although I have one kid that looks full on,
Yes.
don't ask me how those things happen, but they do. So I don't know, it feels unfinished. So I may not be summarizing things with some punctuation or bow, but it feels unfinished to me. It feels like an exploration. And in fact, if I think about what's happened to the Filipino people over hundreds of years, even prior to the Spaniards coming through and doing what they did there, which is its own Zoom class, plus 10 million others, unpacking all of that. We have many lifetimes to unpack what it means to be Filipino in the world, and to be Filipino American in the world, and to be Filipino American in America, and all of that. So it's been a patient thing, but I do know that in this lifetime, for my own relationship with my mother, even let's say my grandmother and my children, it's unfinished. So we have a book that is probably barely opening.
Well, I love it. It's been such a pleasure to be able to witness you from years before this journey started, and then to also just hang back and see you take it all in, and to also encourage you to just let it all in and to sit with it. And it's such a pivotal and life-changing thing that it's not something that you can digest right away, because it is truly something that's going to be a lifelong experience. And so, you know, for where it is, where you're at right now, I think it's you're perfectly perfect where you're at. And in the spirit of the gratitude series, what are you grateful for, Michelle? What are all the things that you're grateful for right now?
I find myself right now in an interesting stage of like craving more of what I experienced as far as being rooted and grounded. And even though we have a quarantine and lockdown measures, although they're releasing whatever it is here in the United States, I find like a tension or a resentment when I have to speed up and move fast and be pulled into that thing, whatever that thing is. And so what I would say that I feel most grateful for every day is the most obvious, right? It's to have a culture within my own family that is one of openness to exploration, into imperfection, into healing, into love and connection. And what I am also most grateful for are all of the privileges that I am afforded in this mixed race, diasporic, historic, there's racism and systems and oppression, all this, that I happen to be in the position that I'm in to do the work of understanding all of this without directly experiencing some of those painful traumas, so that I can take on my work. Every generation, it's my belief that every generation takes up some kind of work of the family history. This might be something that's taught in BaZi. Yeah, like every generation takes up some sort of from the family line. And so I think I feel fortunate, without needing to even contrast it in, oh, they suffered so that I could live so well, but to also connect to what suffering means. What suffering do I bring to myself and do I bring to other people, and how can I heal and restore and make whole? What kind of work can I do that's meaningful? And I'm just grateful to be alive. I'm grateful to be here in this lifetime, having these experiences, and to be here, period. There's my punctuation.
I love it. Yes to all of that. Salamat, Michelle.
Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I know that there's more parts to this, but it's always nice to hear these kinds of experiences, and it gives us a moment to reflect on our own. Where did we come from? And maybe we'll take a moment to pause and really appreciate some of those stories that we hear from our older members of the family. I certainly didn't appreciate it as much when I was younger as I think I do now. And it's like nobody is around to tell me anything. And so while you have that, cherish it and continue to share and to shine your light. And your children are so absolutely lucky to have you as their mama. And, yes, so that's that for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully this uplifted your day in the middle of the week. We're sending love. Mahal kita, mahal kita. So thank you so much, everybody. I'll see you again next week. Bye, Michelle.
Bye, guys.
Bye.